Well, Europe doesn't want to negotiate at the moment. They don't want the deal, they don't want peace. So they're not engaged with a diplomatic process because fundamentally they want the war to continue. They want the war to continue because they think if it continues there might be a better outcome for Ukraine and for themselves. But you know, they want the war to continue because at the very least it will have the effect of weakening Russia. So you know, there's no serious discussion about diplomacy, about negotiations, or who might actually negotiate on behalf of Europe.
Professor Roberts, thank you so much for being with us, for joining this forum and sharing your thoughts and your ideas about what is happening globally, what the serious historical period of time we're living in, like the changing world order and emerging multipolarity and etc. A lot of kind of names we can say about contemporary history of the mankind. But I would like to ask you about the history of since the World War II. How much that history affected what is happening now? Because the world order we believed until now was established after the World War II, and how much that history affected the conflict with Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, between Russia and the West. Is that interesting to look at?
Well, if you're talking about the Second World War, obviously that has a very crucial bearing on what's happening today, eventually, because what happens as a result of the Second World War is that Ukraine expands territorially, Ukraine expands territorially because the Soviet Union takes over Western Ukraine, Galicia, which had formerly been part of Poland. And there's also some other bits of territory that are gifted to to Ukraine by Stalin and the Soviets. And then later on, of course, in 1950 or before, we have this famous transfer of Crimea to Ukrainian control. The other thing that's happening as a result of the war is that, there's a lot of collaboration with the Nazis in Nazi occupation in Ukraine during the war, particularly on the part of extremist Ukrainian nationalists. And what happens at the end of the war is that the Ukrainian nationalist struggle against the Soviet regime, against communism, continues for a number of years. So there's the Soviets have to wage a substantial counterinsurgency campaign in Western Ukraine, also in Poland and the Baltic states, to actually suppress partisan opposition to Soviet rule. And in a way, what's happened in recent years is there's been a kind of revival in Ukraine of those ultra-nationalist traditions, yes, and including the militaristic angle. Okay, the other thing to say about history is that in terms of the current situation in relation to Russia and Ukraine, and of course the war, is that historically the really big turning point there is 1991.
Yes.
When you get the breakup of the Soviet Union. Okay, and the breakup occurs on the basis that the borders of what becomes independent Ukraine will be the same borders as the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what that meant was that large numbers of Russian speakers became part of independent Ukraine. Now, that was a complication, but it wasn't a fundamental problem. It wasn't a fundamental problem all the while independent Ukraine and the Russian Federation maintained a friendly relationship with each other. And that essential to that relationship was the Ukraine remaining an independent, neutral, and non-aligned state. Yeah, there are problems, tensions, but they can all be dealt with within that context of a friendship. In fact, was it 1997? The Russian Federation and Ukraine actually signed what's effectively a treaty of friendship. Okay, but what happens is that you get the so-called Orange Revolution in Ukraine. You get the coming to power of more radical Ukrainian nationalist element, and that radical Ukrainian nationalist element is dedicated to asserting Ukraine's independence from Russia, including by aligning Ukraine with the West, aligning Ukraine with the EU, and aligning Ukraine with NATO. So Ukraine starts to make moves towards joining the European Union, but also, more importantly, to become a member of NATO. And there's the famous declaration in 2008 where NATO welcomes Ukraine and also Georgia as potential members of NATO. So it's the change in Ukraine's status as a neutral state. It's realignment in a Western direction. That's actually what leads to the current set of problems we have, and ultimately to the war in Ukraine.
So, and since we're talking about the World War II, one of the arguments from the Russian perspective against Ukraine was kind of that this is not just the nationalist, but also the neo-Nazis in Ukrainian power, in Ukrainian influential groups in Ukraine, etc. How much is it true on one hand, and how much it is a reason for the conflict?
Well, I think it's certainly a reason for the conflict. Certainly, the Russian perception was that, ultra-nationalist, neo-Nazi elements were becoming more and more powerful in Ukraine, particularly in the military field. On the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Russians, they said this. They said, I think it was the intelligence chief, actually, Russian intelligence chief at that time. He said that there's 50 territorial battalions in Ukraine which are associated with the Russian armed forces, which are dominated by neo-Nazi elements. That was the claim. And so there was a kind of belief that, eventually this kind of like ultra-nationalist neo-Nazi influence, which was very militaristic in its orientation, would actually lead to an attempt by Ukraine to regain control of Crimea and also to regain control of the Donbass. The Donbass, of course, which had separated from Ukraine at the same time as Crimea did, but until 2022 hadn't actually completely seceded and become part of the Russian Federation. So certainly, without a doubt, the Russian perception and belief in the role of neo-Nazism in modern contemporary Ukraine is very strong and authentic. I think it's probably a little exaggerated, but nevertheless, it's a real problem. And also, I'd say it's becoming more real because I think in the context of the war, the neo-Nazi element, particularly in relation to their role in the Ukrainian military, has actually grown stronger and stronger. In fact, you could argue that it's this neo-Nazi element is one of the most fundamental impediments to some kind of peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, because the neo-Nazis, or at least some of them anyway, the more radical elements, don't want to make any deals at all with Russia.
Remembering World War II, what is more concerning today is kind of the increasing rhetoric of the European elite, some particular countries, that they are preparing for the new war with Russia for 2029 and 2030. They need some kind of increasing military expenditure and etc., etc. So how do they feel? Was that lesson from for World War II learned, or it has already been forgotten?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, there certainly is a growing kind of belief, perception in Europe, among certain European politicians and military leaders, that there's going to be a war with Russia in the not too distant future. And associated that, there are all kinds of policies and programs to do with rearmament and with a general kind of effort to try and make European societies more kind of militaristic, better prepared, and more willing to actually participate in direct conflict with Russia. Now, I'm not sure. I mean, I think at the rhetorical level, it's very, very strong. Yeah. This anti-Russia, prepare for war for Russia position. But I'm not sure in practice how strong it is.
A lot of people say that this is just a kind of rhetoric for the increasing the budget fundings and etc.
I think there's certainly it is rhetoric for the purpose of increased defence budgets. Yeah, it's very self-interested in lots of ways. But I think there's also a core of belief in the reality of the Russian threat. Yeah, I don't think the Russian threat is invented. Yeah, I think they truly believe that the Putin regime is an expansionist regime. After Ukraine, the Baltic states, Poland next. Yeah, there's an inevitable struggle, right? Okay. Now, okay, that's the belief.
Amazement?
That's the belief. But it's a very dangerous belief because it's wrong. Yeah, there is no evidence that Russia has those kind of expansionist ambitions, or is Russia
and
is
possibilities.
Possibilities. Yeah, sure, Russia is preparing for war with Europe, but that's because the Europeans themselves are saying they're prepared for. What do you expect? The Russia. So it's a very dangerous and misleading perspective. When there is no reason in principle, aside from beliefs and perceptions, why there can't be peaceful relations between Russia and its neighbours. Russia and Poland, Russia and the Baltic states, Russia and Georgia, all kinds of countries. Obviously Ukraine, there's a war going on, so that's a particular kind of situation. But then again, in case of Ukraine, there is no reason the war in Ukraine can't come to an end very soon, if there was the political will to do it. And okay, that would be a kind of Russian victory. It would be a kind of Ukrainian defeat. But nevertheless, Ukraine would continue to exist as an independent sovereign state. Yeah, it would continue to largely control its own fate. Okay, it would have to make compromises about its sovereignty in terms of its relationships with Russia. It would have to be neutral and so on. Yeah, there would be a price to be paid, but nevertheless, Ukraine would continue to exist as a free and independent state. The problem is that if the war doesn't come to an end soon, then the very future of the Ukrainian state could come into question. Yeah, the longer the war goes on, the greater the defeat will be for Ukraine, the more chances that the whole country and whole society might disintegrate under the hammer blows of war.
So, and on the other hand, by the way, the in parallel regime of the kind of aggressive rhetoric, we have another kind of rhetoric, the kind of rhetoric of the negotiations. So, searching of negotiator in the Western side, in the European continent, who could be representing Europe with the negotiations with Russia and etc. What this kind of ambivalent approach is based on?
Well, Europe doesn't want to negotiate at the moment. They don't want the deal. They don't want peace.
Okay.
So they're not engaged with a diplomatic process because fundamentally they want the war to continue. They want the war to continue because they think if it continues, there might be a better outcome for Ukraine and for themselves. But they want the war to continue because at the very least, it will have the effect of weakening Russia. So there's no serious discussion, about diplomacy, about negotiations, or who might actually negotiate on behalf of Europe. But of course, that's what needs to happen. What Europe should be doing, it should be engaging with Russia. It should find someone to represent its viewpoint to the Russians and engage in serious negotiations, make a contribution to peace. But at the moment, Europe is only contributing to the continuation of war. That's its role. Without European support and all the different forms of assistance, financial, political, diplomatic, military, that Ukraine gets, the war would be over. The Ukrainians would have no choice but to actually do a deal with Putin. It's only the continuing European intervention in the Ukraine war, the continuing European proxy war with Russia that keeps this war going.
So what do you think, in a historical way, a lot of people say the history repeats quite frequently. So, are we in the historical moment of shifting from one global order to another one? Do you agree with this kind of assessment of what is happening now?
Yes. Yeah. Obviously, there's been some very, very important shifts in the nature of world order. If you want to define that world order in terms of power and leadership terms, and broadly speaking, we are in a period of transition to a new multipolar world order, and it's kind of like there's no doubt that that's what's going to happen. There's no way back to a global Western dominance or an American led world order, right? The only choice is what kind of multipolar world order. What are the poles going to be? What are the powers going to be? How they're going to rate themselves? and whether or not it's going to be a stable multipolarity as opposed to an unstable multipolarity, right? And that's the question for the future. I mean, one of the things that I've argued at this forum in my contribution discussion is the strategic importance of strengthening international law. International law is the foundation, the mainstay of relations between states in the context of multipolarity. It's international law that can hold this new multipolar system that's coming into being, can hold it together to stabilise it, right? To make it a context in which all states can participate and all states can benefit from it, both in terms of their security and also in terms of their prosperity. And I think that small states like Georgia have an important role to play in the struggle for a new multipolarity based on international law. Small states, since the Second World War, have been the mainstay, or one of the mainstay of an international system based on state sovereignty and international law. Right? They still are the mainstay, and of course now that Georgia's independent, has been independent for 30 years, it's part of that campaign, that camp in favour of furthering international law.
Finally, what I'd like to ask you, existing world order, we mentioned that this is kind of the result of the World War II, kind of big catastrophe, kind of big struggle between big powers and etc. So what has been shifted towards the unipolarity was also the kind of the result of...
Well, no, the current world is not, okay, no, it's not really the result of World War II.
Yeah.
It's actually a result of the Cold War. And a result of because after that,
yes,
at the end of the Second World War, the perspective was that there would be a multipolar world, right?
Yes.
At the top of which would be Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Yes. They would preside over the world together, for their own benefit, but also for the rest of the world. But they would actually provide peace and security for the whole world. So there would be like a global hegemony of the great powers that had won the Second World War, had actually defeated Hitler. Of course, think about Hitler and the Nazis. One of the things they wanted to do, they wanted to destroy the international state system. They wanted to get rid of sovereign states, independence, international law, and impose their Nazi imperialism on the rest of the world. So that was but of course what happened? You got a Cold War. It was the Cold War that destroyed great power unity and shunted aside this project for a multipolar world based on the global hegemony of the great victor powers of the Second World War. Okay, so then you have the Cold War. Then of course you have the post-Cold War. Now in the post-war period, there's actually an opportunity to revive the Second World War project of a collective hegemony of the great powers with new powers, not just the big three of the Second World War, but new powers. But that doesn't happen because the West, in the so-called Union moment, strives to actually impose its total domination over the international system and over world policy, and excludes Russia from any effective say in constructing the new post-Cold War order. And of course Russia is weak, so Russia can't do very much about it. But of course the situation then changes. Russia revives as a power. China, of course, becomes more and more powerful. The limits of Western power, US power, are exposed, particularly in the context of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah. So in historical terms, I suppose there's two big failures. There's the failure to continue, to create a new world order, a stable world order at the end of the Second World War. Instead, you've got the Cold War, and then there's the post-Cold War failure to create a new stable world order, including all of the great world's great powers.
And I mean, I would like to ask you about that. Now we see that there are at least two big powers, Russia and China, which are challenging the unipolarity of the United States.
Yes.
So in previous times, that came to kind of the big catastrophe like World War II, and when big powers challenging each other, that comes to the, can we avoid this kind of catastrophe right now? And what could be said about that?
Yeah, okay, look, Russia and China are challenging Western global hegemony,
Yes.
United States domination, so.
Yeah.
But they're challenging on the basis that they want the United States to be a partner in the new global order, in the new
Not to destroy that.
No, absolutely
Yes.
not. They want United States, and in the multipolar future, if there is going to be a multipolar future at all, the United States
Is
will
it
be.
possible?
I think it is possible. Look, if it's possible for Russia and China to collaborate, why isn't it possible for Russia and China and the United States to collaborate? Okay. It's actually entirely possible. And of course, the thing that provides a kind of fundamental existential block to, to the outbreak of a great war, a new great war, a third world war, is of course the existence of nuclear weapons. Yeah, I mean Russia, China, United States, each has the capability of destroying the whole world many times over, including China, which has got the smaller nuclear arsenal. So there is that fundamental existential interest in establishing a stable relationship between the three great powers. Okay, and the other thing, a point to be made about multipolarity. Yeah. Okay, yeah, it's based on like equality, sovereign equality, and all this kind of thing. But really, you need a stabilizing center in the form of collaborating great powers. Yeah, you need the great powers to actually carry out their responsibilities, to maintain the system, to stabilize the system, to deal with problems that may arise in its operation, and also, above all, to maintain peaceful relationships between themselves.
And finally, my last question, like a Georgian, I mean, for my country, for the small country, like some people say in between, some people say on the border with the great power, and et cetera, et cetera. So what concerns me is the nuclear power, nuclear bomb. Yeah. Why? Because I do understand that, as you said, that the big powers won't fight to each other. Sure. But that increases the risks of the proxy wars between the big powers. Right. And the small countries are usually sacrificed in this struggle. What is the solution for us in your opinion?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's because that's the most important thing about the Ukraine war.
Yes.
It's that it's a proxy war, it's a conventional proxy war, but it bears within it the danger of escalation into a direct war, and including into a nuclear war. And a nuclear war will affect everyone. Yes, every country in the world, including Georgia, which is why Georgia has, all countries should has a vital interest in peace, right? In doing what they can on their own and as part of groups of states to actually encourage a path to peace in relation to Ukraine and the stabilization of Russia's relationships with the United States and Europe, and to head off this headlong rush to militarism in Europe. So Georgia, in and of itself, is only a very small player, but as part of a broader coalition of small and medium-sized powers, it's actually potentially hugely powerful, right? But as far as I can see at the moment, the emphasis in Georgian foreign policy seems to be on realigning Georgia with the EU, with the United States, with that Western orientation. Okay, and I understand that. That you can see that as a rebalancing of its relationships. But they also need to, Georgia, in my opinion anyway, I'm not telling Georgians what to do. Yeah. Then they need to also assert their independent role as a neutral, non-aligned state, in favour of peace.
Yeah, Professor Roberts, thank you so much for your time, for your insights.